Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Soul Surplus Podcast. This is episode 5. We've been out of pocket for the entire month of May. What was it, Smythe? 2 weeks, your interface was down. Your very expensive interface at that. You didn't have that. And then 1 week I was out of town. And then the next week, something else came up. So it was just a bad month altogether. But we're just glad to be back here with episode 5. Smythe, how you doing, man?
Pretty good, man. I'm excited to talk about this topic we have today. Yeah, how are you?
I'm doing good. I am a tad tired today. I had one of those, you rest and relax a little bit too much weekends. So, definitely looking forward to getting back into the swing of things. So
Nice.
took my foot off the gas just a little bit. The fellas had a show Friday, and then they had an engagement on Saturday to go to. And so I was just like, well, if the fellas are going to be out of pocket Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, then maybe I'll be out of pocket. So I was playing video games pretty much like the whole weekend. And I'm excited to get into this topic as well. I think this is going to be a topic that our listeners are going to be very excited to hear and to learn from. This topic is definitely more in your wheelhouse. Once again, it's not that I don't have a background or knowledge of what we're talking about, but this is not really like my go-to, and this is not my, my talent level is a little bit lower in this field, but yeah, man, I'm ready to get into it. So what are we talking about today, bro?
So today's topic is mixing with EQ. And so for you guys that don't know, I'm sure most of you already know what EQ is. EQ is equalizing, which is adding or reducing volume of certain frequencies of a signal. So as opposed to increasing or decreasing the volume of the whole signal, you're just selecting either bass frequencies and or mid frequencies and or high frequencies. So there's two types of EQ that we use when mixing, and that is additive EQ and subtractive EQ. So we're going to talk about both today, and I'm going to start with additive EQ. So additive EQ is increasing the volume of certain frequencies in a signal. So there's certain pros and cons. I know when we first start out in our DAW, we have pretty much the same kind of graphic equalizer. And, we change the sound of something by doing crazy, shelving EQs in the high frequencies. And, it's pretty cool. You get a really drastic sound, which can be good, but it can also be detrimental.
Right.
So I'm going to talk about the pros of additive EQ. So the pros are it can add definition to the source, which is, a beautiful thing. I like to use a Pultec style EQ, which is a tube equalizer. And basically what it does is it's a passive equalizer, and it has a really smooth sound. So I like to increase 10 kilohertz, 12 kilohertz, those kind of high frequencies, and it really adds a lot of definition. It kind of opens up whatever you're boosting. It opens up the signal a lot. It imparts color on the signal. Again, talking about the Pultec style EQ, I also like 1073, a kind of EQ, which is on the 1073 pre.
Which you actually talked about on one of a previous blog post that's on the website, so you guys might want to go check that out.
Check it out.
We'll add the link in the description notes for this episode to go check that out.
Yeah, I talked about both of them actually.
You did.
The warm audio. Yeah. So these kinds of EQs, they have tubes and transformers in them, like the Carnhill transformers in the 1073 style EQ. And not only does it boost those frequencies, but it also adds a certain color to it that maybe you might not get from your signal already. So a good example of this is boosting bass. Maybe you record a bass or you record a kick drum and it sounds good, but as far as the low frequencies, it's a little flat. And by flat, I don't mean in a negative way, but it's just not really thumping the way you want it to.
Right.
And so with certain EQs, when you boost those low frequencies, you get a nice hump, like a hip hop style, like kick drum.
Right.
Stuff like that is really cool. So yeah, those are the pros. I think I forgot one pro. So the last pro is that it can completely change what the source sounds like.
Right.
And it's funny, this is also the first con, but I'll talk about the good part of this. So when you're boosting crazy amounts of EQ, done tastefully, you can really take a sound and just change it. And one of my favorite applications for this is snare drums. So you can take a snare drum and boost. I actually did this yesterday. I was mixing and I boosted 1K, like 1.6K. And the snare, it sort of, it opened up in not a high frequency kind of way, because of course 1K is that mid-range band.
Right.
I guess I mean not in a piercing way.
Right.
But it was more so just something that like punched through the mix really well. But listening to the dry signal, or what the snare sounded like before the EQ, not that it sounded bad, but it was just really different.
Mm-hmm.
So and of course you can add frequencies like 200 hertz or 400 hertz, where you'll give the snare a lot of body. And a lot of times, like that's body that's not that it's not there, because you can't add frequencies that aren't there, of course, but they're just kind of hiding within the signal. And when you boost them a lot, you can bring it out in a pretty cool way.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's I know when I'm doing production, and not just production, but even say like just mixing this podcast, being able to find that right sweet spot for our voices, or like you said in production, to be able to find that right sweet spot. So like I tend to, and you're really familiar with this, Smythe, but I tend to, with my drums especially, I use a lot of breaks. And so I tend to take a lot of the top out, which is something that I guess the next thing that we're going to talk about. But every now and again, if I hand that track over to be mixed, Whit will take that over, still use that same type signal, where he wants to keep the definition of some of those frequencies being cut, but he'll add just enough to make it pop and kind of come right through the mix through EQ. And it's amazing how like you guys can hear, because I can hear pretty well, but I never double down in getting into mixing, mainly because I know that if I double down into getting into it, it would then become an obsession. So I didn't want to turn into the mix guy when one of my best friends is literally the mix guy, and I could just give it to him. You know what I mean? So,
right.
But at the same time, in essence, in what we do is pre-production, when we're making beats, or, we're working on, singles or whatever, there still is an element of EQ that definitely goes into it. So I know a lot of times I'll go into production with the mindset that there's actually going to be a vocal there. And you probably do the same thing too. And so there's certain frequencies that I know, like, perfect example. I just started working on a new project that's slated to come out later this year. And I know there's going to be an MC's voice, and, that's going to be right in the middle of the track. So with that being said, like, I know that with the sample or the instruments that I'm already, adding to the track, I'm already cutting the frequencies where I know his voice is going to be at anyway. And so I feel like I'm going more into subtractive EQ, so I'm sorry. But I'm just saying, like, but at the same time, like, it's great because on the flip side, when his vocals are added, there's going to be much additive EQ added to those vocals, just to make the voice stick out that much better, and to mix a little bit better with the production.
Right. Yeah. One thing I've noticed when I first came on board, or not really on board, but I was, doing sample packs with you guys, and you would mix the packs. I remember specifically in the Daydream pack, there was a lot of frequency cuts where it didn't really, make the samples sound worse, but it just made things fit a whole lot better, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that you're really good at, which is cutting out those frequencies and really getting surgical with that kind of thing. And because the Daydream to me is not the easiest pack to mix, because everything is just straight up the same tone, the same frequency. It's not muddy, but it's just all kind of blends together, you know?
Yeah. Well, it's because you're not lined in with anything that you play. So we're picking up natural reverb, you know, natural delay. And so, I mean, not natural delay, which you understand what I'm saying. We're picking up hardware delay, hardware reverb, straight out of the amp, through a mic'd amp, I should say, as opposed to line in and then post editing for those things in your DAW.
Right. Yeah. You made it work.
Preach. So I know you had some pros, but like, what's some of those cons? Because I think the cons are going to be the thing that the listeners are definitely I really want the listeners to harp on, especially because it's really the cons, because I feel like EQ is like can be the death of a song.
Absolutely.
And that tends to happen more often than not, it seems like, with mixes, unfortunately. Which you would think that by now, in the year of our Lord 2018, with YouTube and all these podcasts like what we're doing, that people would maybe figure out a way, you know, to maybe boost their vocal a little bit in the mix. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. The cons, it's funny, there's only 2 cons, but they're huge. So the first one is that it can completely change what the source sounds like. And in that way, it becomes a rabbit hole, because you know, your ears don't necessarily trick you. You just have to train them to know what you're listening to. So for instance, let's say you record a guitar and it sounds kind of muddy in the low end, and you say, oh well, let me do a high shelving EQ and boost everything from, you know, 3K up, right? Well, really what you could do is just put a high pass filter on it, because what you're hearing is the muddiness between like whatever rumble is below, like 70 hertz or whatever, and then you're hearing that from 70 to about 300-ish, where you probably want to sort of just take a chunk out of that, and then probably turn it up a little bit, and that way you're not adding 10 dB of high frequencies, you know?
Right.
And then what that does, which is the second con, is it decreases the headroom.
Exactly.
And so mixing, when it comes to mixing, headroom is like, man, for me, it's still something that is really annoying, because specifically my problem is with kick drums. So I love for my kick drums to thump and, you know, hit you right in the chest. That's my thing. And so the way I like to do that is I like to add EQ, but I go and look at my metering, and I'm in the middle of the song and I'm clipping by like 3 dB, and that is the most annoying thing. Everything else is cool, but that kick drum is just clipping. And so that's the thing about adding EQ, is because you're inherently increasing the volume of your source, you're decreasing the headroom because everything is becoming louder.
Right.
So adding EQ is definitely necessary. I know maybe a couple years ago, I wanted to just subtract. I had to learn about subtracting. But then I realized that, you know, things can be a little wimpy if you're not adding anything at all.
Right. So with all that being said, I know one thing which can also be the enemy to both EQ and just your track altogether is when you're combining EQ and compression. In your experience, what do you, because I've heard either or.
Right.
I know I tend to be more a compression first and then EQ after, but it really depends on what type of source that I'm going for. But again, that's more in production. It's not necessarily when mixing vocals. So I think it just comes down to, like, in your chain, what works the best. But what in your experience, which one tends to work better for you? Because obviously you're coming from a musician standpoint, especially.
Right. Man, and that's a tough one. I tend to do subtractive before, including, filters and like really narrow cues, cutting, compression, and then additive EQ after.
Gotcha.
But that is not always the case, because you can really shape a source. Like we said, you can change what it sounds like with additive EQ. And then a lot of the times you may want to take what that sounds like and then compress it and, tame the levels.
Right.
And then maybe you cut afterwards, or maybe you don't cut afterwards, or maybe you boost again afterwards. But I guess the point is really that you can kind of do whatever you want, but there are some rules I like to adhere to for certain like instruments. Like definitely for vocals, I cut first and then compression,
Right.
Yeah. What about you?
Got you.
With
vocals?
I mean,
usually in vocals, I tend to be compression first. Like that's the first thing that the line hits is compression. And I know there's probably going to be people listening to this like, why would you do that? I'm just saying, for me personally, in my experience, with the way that I tend to mix my production with the vocals, that's been the best way for me to do it. But like I said, I've seen it done, multiple ways. I'm pretty sure there's technically a right way to do it, which would probably lean more towards the way that you were saying, where you're allowing more for. I guess I'm in that same boat, like, with you, where I'm adding the compression, but then I'm adding the EQ second, and I'm using the EQ to shape that signal just a bit better. I don't know. It just seems to, especially for me, like I said, because I feel like with vocals, I tend to try to, especially depending on where the person has recorded at. So if like they record with Wit, those vocals going, because Wit's, his whole system of, sending it through all these different, variations of hardware, excuse me, I apologize, but all these different variations of hardware, before it gets to the DAW, it already sounds like $1 million. You kind of almost don't even have to touch it much. Once it comes out on the back end, then it's like, my concentration is definitely more on the production from an EQ standpoint. But you already know, like a lot of times there's people are recording in their bedrooms, or they're recording in a studio and the engineer doesn't know what they're doing. And so you end up having to shape the vocal just a bit more. But at the same time, I still feel like in my experience, I still have to tend to shape the production just a little bit more, than the actual vocal. So I like to use let's go through some of these plugins. So I use a variation of Universal Audio plugins. Like 1073, like you use. Trying to think what else. It's pretty much like my go-to, probably. It's pretty much just usually or every now and again I might use the Pultec, like you use, the 1A. But yeah, like I'm not, like I said, I'm not really heavy on that side. But then for compression, like my favorite compressor still to this day is the Glue by Cytomic. I love using that compressor. Wit found that joint like 4 or 5 years ago. Okay. And I think he's moved on since then. This is when he was still, he was still charging, $300 mix. You know what I'm saying?
Those days are gone.
Yeah, those days are long gone. So, yeah, but
guys, don't hit up Wit and ask him to mix something for $300 because I can tell
It
you.
was mad disrespectful. Yeah. So now, and he deserves it, just with all the work that he's put in. But anyway, mine is a bit more on the humble. Like I said, I like to use the Cytomic, and then there's some good. I mean, even low key, Logic's compressor, like the built-in compressor, it's really really good. And to be honest with you, most of Logic's built-in plugins are really good. They shouldn't be that good, but they are. I make whole beats using Logic compressor, and I sidechain using Logic compressor, and everybody's like, "Yo, man, how'd you get it to sound like that?" And I'm just like, "Logic, man."
Yeah, the sidechain compressor in Logic is really great. For me, I find that I like their 1176, like that fast FET compressor for taming the levels. But I do find that for me, there's not enough color in their compressors, because I like that, like the color that other kinds of plugins add, because they're meant to emulate like real
actual hardware.
analog. Yeah,
Exactly.
But for sidechaining, Logic is great. My vocal mixing chain, I'm actually kind of getting my feet wet with it, but I'm making strides now. I'm getting some pretty cool results. So I've got a Heritage Audio 1073 EQ first in the chain. And so that's like 3 bands. Of course, the 3 bands, you have the high pass filter.
Right.
And I didn't have a preamp with a high pass filter on it. And that is the most useful thing ever for vocals, because it gets rid of like that mic stand noise or whatever stuff you don't need.
Right.
And then I send it into the Warm Audio 76 compressor. And that is my favorite. I've been appreciating it more and more. It's my favorite compressor because you can really take something and just push it up to the front of the mix and get all of that detail, because the compressor is like really fast,
Yeah.
From there, going into the Warm Audio 2A compressor, it's supposed to be like a LA2A opto style compressor, which is good for kind of like general compression. You're not really gonna be squashing something to death with it like you can with the 76.
Right.
But it's sort of like a really classy sounding thing. And then from there into the Warm Audio Pultec equalizer. So what I've been doing, and I've been using this to mix snares and kick drums and bass and vocals mostly. What I like to do for vocals is I'll set that high pass filter, which we'll talk about. It's another kind of subtractive EQ.
Right.
And then I kind of do the shaping on that 73 EQ. Maybe I want to I found that adding like that same like 1.6 kilohertz will really push a vocal out to the front. But I know that's also like whenever I mix rappers and they want that telephone sound, that 1.6 is also the same like kind of honky telephone kind of thing. So if you get too crazy with it, it's gonna sound like you're talking on the phone.
Got you.
I'm careful with that. And then into the 76 compressor, and then the 2A. But then the next EQ in the chain, and the last piece in the chain, I'm doing most of my high end boosting, and then a little bit in like the 400 hertz range to give any body that's was taken out by the compression.
Got you.
For kick drums, I actually learned this trick. I was watching one of my friends. He's mixing a heavy rock record, and he cut between 200 and 300 hertz on the kick drum, and it like took all of that. It took all of like that unnecessary, like not necessarily the part of the kick drum that cuts through, but it's sort of, I don't know how to describe it. It's like a very low mid-range, still kind of bass. But when you take that out, it just kind of like, I don't know, it just shapes the kick drum so nicely. And then you can turn that low end up and it's just like hitting the right way, man. It's really great.
Now, do you think that's because he was doing rock? Because I think if you're doing hip hop, you can't cut that frequency at all.
Yeah. So I think in the context of rock music, like he cut it a lot. He was using the Fab filter, the Pro Q, I believe it's called, which is a really great plugin. And yeah, he cut it a lot. Now for hip hop or maybe even soul, I think it still helps depending on the kick drum to cut it. It just focuses the sound a little bit more. Of course, right. if you cut it drastically, then you're kind of sucking all of that life out of the kick drum.
Yeah, between 3 and 4, it's a little low key. You kind of need those frequencies in hip hop.
Yeah, you know no, I mean? it was more like 2 and 3, like around 200. Like it was pretty much a narrow cut. Yeah, it wasn't. But, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was saying, but with the way that rock, like you're not really hearing. I mean, you hear it, but the kick drum is not driving the track a lot of times in rock.
Right.
Whereas in hip hop, if the kick is not driving the track, then you're technically not doing hip hop. You know what I mean?
Yeah, like I was just kind of thinking about how like that Dilla kind of thing where even though the kick drum is very tucked in some cases, it's still, because everything is sidechained to the kick, it's still that driving force, like you said.
It's my favorite thing to do.
Yeah, man, it's pretty cool. Well, I remember you showed me the stuff you did. I think it was called Vine, that album.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went back and listened to that on Spotify. That same weekend, I was like, man, this is crazy.
I appreciate.
Yeah. So one more thing I wanted to ask, because I know you probably sample more than I do. Are there any specific things you do to your samples EQ wise?
With my samples, I tend to do a little bit more subtractive EQ, so a little bit more slicing frequencies. And again, it's specifically because I know that this is, somebody's going to be rapping over top of this. But when I do like a beat tape, that's kind of the best thing about sampling is, it's already mastered. You know what I'm saying? It's already EQ'd and mastered. So if anything, it's just more leveling, just to make sure that it's fitting in the mix nicely. But I do tend to, because one thing that, I catch people off guard a lot of times. Anytime I'm usually sampling on a track, I'm usually actually grabbing more than 2 or 3 samples for that track. So like very rarely am I grabbing just something from that track. I'm usually grabbing from 2 to 3 different sources. So like on Vine, especially, like I think there's only like one track on that whole project where the sample is just, I think it's literally the first track. That sample is just from that track. Like there's nothing that there's no other sample on that joint. But the rest of the tracks, I'm grabbing from, other places, and whether that's like there's like a vocal cue that I like from other track where there's no vocal cue from the joint that I'm sampling. I tend to do that. But anyway, I'm not trying to give all my secrets away, so you guys don't listen to anything I just said. But
listen to the album.
Yeah. Nah, but I tend to use more. I tend to use EQ more for shaping the sample and for placement within the actual track. So and then also I use specific EQs for making the sample just a bit more wider in the mix, adding some stereo elements for other parts of the sample that I want to stick out just a bit more. Like the joint I showed you the other day, like there's probably like 2 or 3 stereo elements, and it was I actually sampled you. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, but there's
Adrian Volume 1.
Yes, and you guys will hear that track later this year. But like with those, like I'm really more, it's really more levels, and then the EQ that I'm using is more for where I want the that particular instrument to be placed in the mix.
Right. Well, real quick, just a little thing I love to do with samples. I like taking the Wolf compressor, and with the wow parameter, of course, is like a wow that fluctuates the pitch. But if you slide up, I think it's the phase knob. You slide it up, it just spreads it out in stereo.
Yep.
And man, doing that with samples, it's so psychedelic, man.
You know, it's so interesting too. Like when I listen to your stuff, it's so crazy how you're like. So I was talking about you to somebody that was asking about the business, and I was saying how your ears it leans so much more to rock than any other genre, and that really is the thing that informs like how you want things mixed. And so like when you like the first Daydream joint, you were like, yo, this sounds great, but like don't cut this frequency the next time, okay? Like don't touch my stuff the next time around. And I was just like, oh, okay, yeah, no problem. You know what I'm saying? I mean, since then I don't even mix stuff anymore. God bless Joel. But yeah, it's so crazy. So like even what you're saying, like, yeah, add phase, it's just like, yeah, man, I probably have used phase probably like 3 times because it starts to sound too psychedelic. Just like, right. I don't want this sounding psychedelic. I want it to sound like you found it underneath a piece of concrete in the Bronx. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly, man.
Yeah, man. But yeah, so let's move on to subtractive EQ, because in my opinion, I feel like the additive EQ is cool, but I feel like the subtractive EQ is really what people need to listen to, especially in this particular episode.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I always like to remember with subtractive EQ is that less is more.
Yes.
You can get more out of something, you can get more out of your track by taking away,
Yep.
But yeah, so subtractive EQs, same thing. There's pros and cons. One of the pros is that it can get rid of muddy and or harsh noise.
Which is the devil of every bad mix.
Yeah.
That you will hear under the sun. Mud. So what would you say that you hear more? Do you tend to hear more mud? So let's give this differentiation. So mud tends to be more low end, and then harsh noise tends to be on the higher end. So do you tend to hear more mud, or do you tend to hear more harsh nowadays?
You mean in my own music, or
no, just in general?
Just in general. Yeah, it's
like when you go on SoundCloud to listen to SoundCloud mud. Producers. Yes.
No, but you know what though, man, I've heard some bad samples that are just like crazy. Like, I don't know. To me, harsh, it has more bandwidth than mud, because mud is generally like 20 to like 300, 400, where harsh can be anything from 1 to 20.
Yeah, very true.
Because like, especially playing guitar and like coming up in playing in church, whenever you hit that one note and all the grandmother are like, oh, And the crazy thing is, I remember when I got my amp fixed one day in Philly, and I was talking to the guy that was fixing it. He said, yeah, guitar amps don't really go above 5 kilohertz, right? But harshness, a lot of people sometimes will think of like, that feedback kind of harsh, like that really high kind of piercing noise.
Right.
But yet guitar can be that same kind of piercing, but it's not even going above 5.
Wow.
So yeah, it kind of like made me rethink how I mix guitar, because a lot of times I find myself cutting at 3 because of the way the guitar is pretty much just mid-range,
right?
Generally. So a lot of times I'll find myself like cutting at 3 kilohertz, but then I'll use a shelving EQ at 8 kilohertz. Mm-hmm. Now, we just said the guitar doesn't go up that high, but you can kind of get a nice kind of like high-end shine on it, because you're boosting everything above it, but it's kind of just touching that like 5 kilohertz, 4 kilohertz with the shelf. So
Right.
kind of digressing, but yeah, like harshness can reach all the way back. Man,
I'm sorry to cut you off. Who currently, like at the present moment, has such an excellent balance. I mean, Kendrick aside, because I just feel like Ali is just, he's probably just the best hip hop engineer right now. Just being honest. But so I don't want to go on a tangent about Ali. If you want to check out Ali stuff, like you can go on Pensado's Place on YouTube. And
he's a student of Dre. That's enough said.
Yeah, his official name is Mixed by Ali. Yeah. And if you go on Pensado's Place on YouTube to their channel, he's got a few interviews where, I mean, and the Pensado's guys are like gods, you know what I'm saying? And so the fact that they are really like giving Ali all his just due, and it's great to see somebody that young getting that type of props. So I don't want to go into talking about him as much, but on the going into somewhere else, the majority of us listened to the new Ye album this weekend. Multiple times, and the one thing that really I feel like Kanye has mastered is there's so much like breathing room in his mixes, because he has like a minimal approach. He seems to go more minimal every album, but with this particular album, there was so much room in between the vocals and the sample, but even like the production, there was mad room in the production too. And if you want to hear a great album from a mix standpoint, where there is no mud and there's no harshness, yet everything is still full and it still bumps but still comes through super clean, listen to Ye. Like I Thought About Killing You, which is the first track, probably the perfect example of like when a mix is just right. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's interesting too, because when I first listened to the project, I kind of was confused. I was like, I don't really know what Kanye is going for, and it was because I wasn't listening. I don't think I truly understood where his mindset, and then obviously with all the other stuff that's been going on, with him and everything. But sonically, it's just really, really good. It's like really good.
You know what, man? So, not to be a contrarian, which I am. So first of all, I really like the album. I love it, actually.
I was about to say, stop it. You love it.
Yeah, no, I really like it. But I thought the mastering, it wasn't mastered all that loud at all.
Which is great. I love low masters are the greatest, bro.
I don't know, man.
You know why? Because you can turn those up so loud.
Right.
So like if you ever talk to me and Wit, like we talked about this in the additive portion of the, and I'm sorry, I feel like we're getting off on a tangent, but kind of talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
But
EQ is you master. I mean EQ and mastering, so it's exactly. All of the yeah.
Exactly. So some of if you ever hear me and Wit talk about mastering, we always say mix and master low, because if you really want a good test of like where a great mix is if you can turn it up in the car. If you could turn it up in the car past like 50 and there's no distortion, that's like,
right. I agree.
That's like the perfect representation of there was somebody behind that console that knew what they were doing. And this is one of those albums, because I tested it. I was in the car and I cranked it and there was no distortion. And so I love low master. So I guess I technically have like a bias towards low master. So if I'm keeping it 100.
You know what though? Like one of the hardest tracks on that album is Yikes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's still, it's still hard, but I just didn't feel that like when it comes in, I didn't feel that feeling. You know, I still love the song. I think it's my favorite song on the album. But you know what, man? I would have to give the best balance to Drake. Drake to me is the most consistent. So of course with 40s behind the boards, his vocals, that's probably the thing I love most about listening to Drake. His vocals are crazy, but to me, like his stuff just hits harder than Kanye's. Like his more recent stuff, especially this year with like God's Plan and Nice for What is an incredible mix to me. But one of the things I value is, I know we both like 21 Savage.
Yo, 21 is my 21 is like my he's that artist that I'm kind of like, I listen to like by myself.
Yeah.
And when I tell people I like 21, they look at me and they're like, what? And I'm just like, I just have, there's something about somebody who I feel like I have a BS meter. And when I listen to 21, nothing is going off when I'm listening to him. Like I 100% believe him. But then also too, you and I think it was it me, you and John? We were talking about this one day. It was more of an argument, really, just to be honest. But we were talking about how one of the endearing things about his music is the way that his voice cuts through the mix. Yeah.
When you tell people that you like 21 Savage and they go, really? You tell them, on God. But I say that to say, like, when I first heard Bank Account, the thing I appreciate the most is how ignorantly loud the bass is. But it's just a choice that works the same way. Like, one of my favorite hip hop mixes is Take It Personal by Gangstar.
Mm-hmm.
You listen to that song in a car, that bass is so ignorantly loud. Right. It makes no sense, but it makes so much sense because it's just a really tasteful decision.
Right, right.
And to me, like that's what I wanted from Kanye's album. But Kanye he never really gives that to you. But to me, like you didn't really get that on Life of Pablo from the mastering. But Life of Pablo still hit hard. Where this album, it didn't hit as hard from a mastering standpoint as Life of Pablo. And I know comparing is like kind of funny, but the songs are great.
Is it that it's not hitting today? Because you know what Kanye, you might come back around to it in like a month and remix it because he does that.
Look, I would be the happiest man on earth. Because those songs they're just really great songs. Aside from all of this, like EQ, whatever, they're just great songs.
We don't want to go into it. We don't want to go down that rabbit hole. Let's bring it back to the EQ.
So the second pro of subtractive EQ is that it increases headroom.
Right.
And I've found, for me personally, in a mix, subtractive EQ it increases the headroom little by little, but it also helps in the fact that you're just not boosting things all crazy, you know?
Right.
And there's nothing better than because I like to mix in mono. When I'm mixing in mono and I get everything to fit, and then I can just turn certain things up and it doesn't get louder. Mm-hmm. That is like the most gratifying thing for me.
Yeah, I think that's the one thing. So the one thing that I've already learned, because I probably sampled you probably 4 times now. Mm-hmm. It's so crazy how your stuff pierces right through the mix, and it's like not even that loud. So there's definitely times where, I mean, I have to cut from a level standpoint. I tend to not have your stuff any louder than like negative 21 dB, negative 24 dB. Yeah, bro. Because I mean, with this, and it's because of the way I produce. But it is like, I mean, it is like right in your face.
Where I get that from, first of all, on my amp, I always have the mid range at like 10.
Oh, okay, got you. Yeah, that makes sense.
But another one of my influences is like Caribbean music. Like compa music is very guitar driven, and African music, where The guitars are they have to like punch through like that because they're holding down the rhythm and the melody and the lead, and it's just the way like they're dancing around there. They're very direct, very in your face, and they're just punchy, you know.
Right.
But that's another one of my influences as to how I like to EQ the guitar is really just crank the mid range.
Right.
So I wanted to talk about the cons of subtractive EQ. What were you gonna say?
I was gonna say, but I definitely know that there's, so because you have that in mind, I would imagine that cutting those EQs will definitely, it won't allow for as much color or add as much, I don't know if the word would be imagination, because that's probably not the right word, but I would imagine that it would definitely add more if you cut those frequencies. It's probably taking a whole lot away from that particular instrument, especially a guitar, I would think.
Yeah, that's the first con. So instruments kind of lose that magic. So they lose that magic particularly when you solo them out. So yeah, it's kind of something that like me, I had to learn to prioritize. So this is what I mean. Maybe you're making space, like you said, for a vocal with your samples, right? And this is why in mixing, you don't really want to mix with things soloed because you're not getting a reference of what it sounds like amongst everything else. So let's say I've got a synth. I find this particularly with synths, maybe because of the way they're filtered, like it's mostly sitting in like that 500 kind of range, and then maybe around like 1,000 or something. And so there's not much information on that synth anywhere else.
Gotcha.
So you can't cut that frequency in the synth because then it's just gonna get lost in the mix, you know. So a lot of times what you have to do is you have to find, well, what is it competing against, and then cut that 500 and then cut that 1,000 maybe with sort of a narrow Q, and then turn the synth up, and then it's going to sit without the frequencies clashing.
Right.
But of course, when you solo whatever you cut, when you solo that out, it sounds silly. But the key is to prioritize and not make the things that you cut the most sit further out in the mix. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, definitely. Mm-hmm.
So like you don't make a lot of, well, hopefully not making a lot of crazy cuts on your vocal, because your vocal's gonna have to sit out front. So let's say you don't want to cut like 2K, like a wide 2K band on your vocal to make a guitar sit there, because your vocal's gonna be most times sitting in front of the guitar, and you're gonna get a weird like thin sounding vocal. So you want to cut that guitar instead, and then you can boost the guitar in certain ways so that it'll sit right, but your vocal's out in front, so you're not gonna get like. I hope this is making sense to you guys.
No, it is.
Yeah.
I think the listeners will definitely understand what you're saying.
Yeah. The other con is that it can take time to find those frequencies. After doing it for a while, you kind of get an idea, especially for me, like I'm mostly mixing my own stuff, so I know certain areas where like I usually have to cut, but every track is different. Sometimes like finding those frequencies just takes a while. You gotta be patient and find like, okay, this is clashing in these frequencies, so let me cut this here. Like it can take some time,
Right. Yeah, I think that's the best part about being, if you've been producing long enough, you tend to have an overall idea of where you like certain sounds to sit in the mix. So like I know exactly where I like my samples to sit. I know exactly where I like my snare to sit and the kick. You know what I'm saying? There's not usually much variation in that. And then, that's the best part about being able to hand it over to a real engineer in the post process, because, there might be a place that the sample needs to sit that's just going to make it that much better.
Yeah. Again, like having an engineer is perfect because they'll already have that understanding, and they've mixed more things than we have, and they do it on more of a regular basis. So they know where things sit and what makes things sound nicely when you're mixing. So it is a luxury, but if you're doing it yourself, you just gotta tough it through and have patience. I also, do you mix in mono?
No, I should, but I don't.
I was watching. Of course, if you've watched Mix by Ali, he mixes in mono, which is where I learned to do that from, and it worked for me. I was watching Chris Lord Algae, who's a mixing engineer. He does more rock stuff, and he was laughing at people who mix in mono. He said, "No, like I want to see what it sounds like in big speakers." Like, he gets more of his I guess his sound from that. Like, he can identify the frequencies better. But I say that to say that however you have to configure your monitoring to hear the frequencies better, or maybe get some treatment in your room, that's really going to help not just EQing in the mix process, but also the recording process. And we actually have an article about acoustically treating your room. If you guys haven't checked that out, that's also very helpful.
Yeah,
so
I'll definitely add that in the show notes as well.
Yeah. So subtractive EQ is, for me, really a mindset. And it's more of something that I do when I'm mixing, or if I just know, like, yeah, I got to cut this on the guitar, or I know I need to make this narrow cut at whatever frequency. It just becomes a mindset I have to shift from. I need to change the way this sounds. I need to add so and so dB of EQ, where I have to shift and say, all right, I need to put the puzzle together. And that's what it's become in my head, is a song is like a puzzle, and everything has to fit nicely,
Yep.
And
yeah. What are your so I know, like, with me, with like some of my favorite, or it's just not my favorite, but like a common frequency for me to cut for like bass line is like, I don't allow bass line any higher than like 550. But that's only because of the way that I do production, right? So it's interesting because I've actually made my own VST out of John's bass line from one of the packs. I just created my own VST. And so when you hear it, it's just like, oh wow, that has like a really good tone. So I get people all the time, and just like, yo man, where's that bass line from? And I'm like, well, I was playing it, but also John was playing it too. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So that's for bass. For kick drum, I tend to cut depending on what type of kick drum it is, because obviously, there's going to be some kick drums that are more thump than punch. So those frequencies will vary. For something that's a little bit more punchy, I'll probably cut more towards the top end. But if I need if I need a lot of thump, I'll literally cut a bass kick drum all the way down to like 350.
Really?
Yeah, because I tend to side chain too. You know what I'm saying? So
right.
You're gonna get that thump regardless. For snares, I usually it's usually more just like really, really high up. You're talking like 11, 12. Nothing super crazy. And then with samples, it tends to be right around, I would say like 1,000 to 1,100, around that range.
Right. That's where the vocal is. I see.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's funny, like John's bass tone is very hi-fi, so you're getting a pretty broad range of frequencies. Like his bass goes up to like probably up to like 3K, something like that.
I was literally about to say it goes all the way like
Yeah.
up to the top. It's like I have to. I literally. It sounds like I had my iPhone just right up to his finger on the bass, and like that's how much detail that I get in his stuff. And if you know what you're doing, or I mean, maybe you want that in your track. Like it really depends on what you're doing.
Yeah.
But I know with what I'm doing, I'm like, nah, I need to cut all that out. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and so the kind of bass I use different strings. I use flat wound strings. Mine don't even go above 550, depending on the kind of preamp. Because I noticed I started using solid state preamps, and it gives a little more detail in that like mid range area. But through a tube preamp, like forget it. You're not even hearing that.
Right.
So I actually tend to high pass when I'm using flat wound strings, because it just gets to be a little too much. Like actually the beat that I did for the organ pack, the demo beat, the bass is actually still, I still think it's a little too loud, but I actually high passed that, and it's still like crazy. So I find myself always cutting for the kind of bass that I use. I don't really add much, just some compression to like get the levels right so all the frequencies are kind of even, and then high passing. And then
what's interesting? I mean to cut you off. Well, one of the things that I've been doing is I've actually stopped leveling my bass off as much, because like everybody just uses 808s now.
Yeah.
I don't use 808s a lot. But it's interesting if you add that bass line, especially if it's not like an overly complicated bass line. It's like the joint I sent you this weekend, super regular bass line. I didn't cut that bass line on purpose because there's no 808. So when you listen to it in the car, it has that same, or I mean, not even just listen to in the car, but just even in the monitors in the office, like it kind of has that same feel of an 808 without, an 808. Everybody uses 808s now. It's just, I don't mind it, but it's just, I just don't, Anyway, I don't want to get off on a tangent.
Well, no, it's the times, I always, for the music that I make, usually the kick drum is like carrying all of the low end. Not all of it, but a lot of times I like for the kick drum to like fulfill that area like below the bass.
Right.
Getting them to sit together is always kind of a thing, I don't want to say it's always challenging, but it's not always easy.
Right.
But yeah, so and then snares, I like to high pass snares. Again, this is with this stuff, like these aren't all the time things, but it's gonna vary from song to song. So like I just released a single with my group called The Latest, and the song is called Get a Grip, and that snare drum is sort of like an 80s kind of compressed kind of snare.
Right.
And so when I was mixing it, like I was just getting a bunch of mud, and then I high passed the snare, and it was almost like everything just sounded way better.
Right.
Yeah, because those kind of snares are just like super bass heavy. They sound like toms with beads on them.
Yeah, straight up. Yep.
So yeah, those are frequencies I like to cut for snares. Of course, we talked about bass drum, and I don't sample a lot, but most of the time, like I high pass my samples, because I like for sometimes with the bass and the sample, I like the bass to just be like really crazy, like loud, and then it just sits with sort of like I did with that organ track.
Yeah,
like the bass. Of course, I don't want the bass to be that crazy, but I kind of like thin the organ out because there's, Swoop was playing some bass notes in the organ, and I just wanted to kind of, change the bass. But yeah, so we do have 3 tips for successful EQing, and hopefully these will help you guys in making your next tracks and making your productions and help your song sound a lot better. So tip number 1, as we just talked about, is cut unneeded frequencies. Just because it'll make everything sound better. You don't need super piercing highs. You don't need super boomy lows. You need appropriate lows and appropriate highs,
Right.
So yeah. Anything you want to say about that? Any added tips within that?
I'm just going to say this on this one part because I definitely forgot to say it, and I'm glad we're talking about it in this particular point. I was talking about 808s and how, I don't use them, but the one thing that when you really understand why 808s are so good is when you go to a live show and that engineer, that dude can crank that bass and it just cuts right through.
Yeah.
And it's not muddy at all. But anyway.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, cutting unneeded frequencies, and 808 definitely helps you do that a little bit better because it's toned. But anyway, Go ahead.
So tip number 2 is properly gain stage when boosting to avoid clipping your meters. I don't think we talked about this a lot, but when you're boosting, sometimes you want to turn the gain down depending on how much you boosted. So a good example is if you're EQing your bass, let's say you do a shelving EQ at like 50 or 60 hertz, your bass is going to increase, your volume is going to increase. So what you want to do is turn the overall volume down, and that's going to shape your sound so that you're going to get more of a bassy sound, but you're not going to be clipping your meters on your output or on the bass track.
Right. That definitely goes into, I think, with the making headroom, and then just to check to make sure that your signal is not too loud.
Right. And tip 3, maybe the most important and the one that I try to live by: the better quality source material, the less EQing is needed at the mix stage.
Facts.
So this is why I like to high pass vocals. I like to high pass acoustic guitars, electric guitars. I like to make all the cuts and boosts that I need so that I don't have to do that much when I'm mixing the track. I don't have to have as many plugins on the channel strip. It's just easier,
Right. Yeah, man.
I don't think you can get away with not EQing at all in a mix because it's just something that you have to do. But you don't always want to have to be thinking about like, oh man, like, what is this? Why is this sounding like this? What is this rumble? Like, or now I have to add another plugin, but my CPU is almost maxed out.
Right.
So that stuff just helps. They're little decisions that help with the big picture.
Right. Yeah, man. Great episode today. We thank you guys for checking in. We hope everything that we shared today was informative. Be sure to check out all of the past podcast episodes. You can find us on iTunes as well as SoundCloud, on our website at soulsurplus.com. Once again, we thank you for checking into episode 5, and we'll definitely see you guys next week. Peace.
All right. Peace.